Hello and welcome to another Times Radio members question and answer. Today we're answering comments and questions from our channel members on frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I currently present Times Radio Frontline, but I'm a global commentator on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, cyber, terrorism, and anything else people ask me to comment on. So let's get straight into your points. First one comes from Anthony. And Anthony, you say that the Trump MAGA have ripped Pax Americana to shreds. In that same destruction, he has removed the nuclear deterrent, he has given a green light and paved the way for Putin to start World War III without fear of retribution. Well, I'm assuming, Anthony, you're American. You are in a better place to comment on how much Trump and MAGA have ripped the US apart. But certainly I'm seeing greater polarization, and we'll see in the midterm elections this year what impact that's going to have from a political perspective. The removal of the nuclear deterrent, I don't think that has been removed quite yet. It's US potential conventional support for NATO, but certainly the confusion that there is around NATO and the US continuing to support Article 5 is something that Vladimir Putin will be sitting smiling at and looking for opportunities to exploit. What I see him doing is to try and create greater division between the United States and Europe, and therefore greater division in NATO over the next weeks and months. And he'll be watching that. He'll be watching it closely. And if he thinks that America has withdrawn completely, yeah, he could try and start World War III. But I think we're way off that yet. There's a few indicators and warnings that they haven't quite been ticked yet. I'll be watching them very closely. So watch Frontline and we'll keep you up to date with that. Next point comes from Stephen. Stephen, most definitely Trump has stimulated the European defense industry. Ukraine doesn't need expensive, overpriced American weapons systems. Some better navigation systems, AI, software, radar systems, etc. would be nice coming from the US, but the EU has engineers that can do the job, surely. Stephen, you're 100% right. And a lot of the weapon systems and the complex weapon systems that are out there, elements of them have been designed in Europe. Let's look at the F-35, for example. The software for the logistics support for the F-35, which is the computer code and the database is hosted in the United States. The software is written in the UK. So there are some very good engineers across Europe. It's just Europe and the UK has not invested in defence and defence manufacturing for so many years. It has relied on getting stuff from the United States or from elsewhere. But now that it's been woken up and stimulated, I think we will see in the future European defence industries being in competition with the US defence industries, and I suspect beating them on the global stage. And that's something that is not going to bode well for the US defence industry. Look at the stock prices. US defence industry stocks are actually going down at the moment, whereas European ones are rocketing. Next point comes from Randy, and you're commenting on Anders Asplund's economic analysis. You say, wasn't much of the 2 years of good Russian economic growth militarily related that didn't benefit much of anyone. Wasn't much of the 2 years of good Russian economic growth militarily related that didn't benefit much of anyone. I think you're focusing on the fact that the Russian economy did grow for a period of time. The military budget grew, but the people that only benefited from it were the oligarchs who were ripping the Russian military off. But that's normal practice in anything that goes on in Russia. Yeah, the economic growth didn't do the Russian military any good whatsoever. Now that the Russian economy is flatlining or more likely nosediving, then Putin is in for a difficult 2026. Next point from Brett, and you say, Trump dying would not be a problem for Putin, but a benefit. Vice President Vance is less capricious and influenced by flattery, but entirely on board with trying to destroy the EU. Surely he'd be far worse for Ukraine and Europe and much more aligned with Russia. Brett, I think nail, head, hammer, hit. You've hit the nail on the head there. J.D. Vance is, he does not have the experience in leadership at a global level. He does not have a good understanding of geopolitics. He shoots from the hip a lot, and he could be worse than Donald Trump. And Donald Trump shoots from the hip a lot. Trump is actually achieving some things. Whether they're going to be good from a longer term perspective, we have to see. J.D. Vance is too much of an unknown quantity, and could be very, very bad for global stability and certainly for the stability in the United States. So yes, fair point. Next point comes from Steve. Steve, Putin separated the US from NATO. That's a big accomplishment, isn't it, Steve? Yeah, it is. And if you look at what Putin's doing, he's trying to create different fractures across Europe. He tried very early on to create a fracture between the UK and the EU whenever he blamed the British Royal Navy for attacking the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, because he thought that the EU would then round on Britain because of Brexit and use that as an excuse to try and attack them. It's not working, but he is good at influencing, and he has partially separated the US from NATO. I say partially because he's created uncertainty, no more than that, but that's what Putin likes to do. Next point comes from Marty. Marty, how certain can we be that 48% of GDP spending on military, of the 4.4 to 8% of GDP spending on the military in Russia, it feels like they spend a lot more, especially when including the regional spending, sign-up bonus, death payments, etc. Our first finances from regional budgets, not directly from the state. Marty, very good points. The Russian expenditure on the military, if you look at it from a holistic perspective, which is what you're pointing at, is certainly significantly more than 4 to 8%. It's probably nearer 40 to 60% in what's going on, and it's going to get worse. As the Russians import much more stuff from China and from North Korea and elsewhere, the debt is growing. They will be mortgaging something to have to pay for that. And the Chinese have certainly got their eyes on some very valuable Russian assets should Russia not be in a position to pay the debts that it will have with China for the support that it's getting. So, yeah, you're right. Russia's spending a lot more. And final point comes from John. John, you say, my cousin studied in Dresden and lived in a building filled with students. Students like to party and make friends. They knew that the KGB had spies, and there was one guy who was the only student living in the complex who didn't greet other students in the elevators. He would back off into a corner, stare at them coldly. She recognized him years later when he became leader of Russia. It was Vladimir Putin. John, 100% right. What a good story. Fascinating story. Yes, sending people in as students is a very good way of giving intelligence officers a bit of experience in different countries. And of course, Vladimir Putin was KGB way back in the time and was focused in East Germany. That was where he operated. But great story. So thanks for watching this week's question and answer and posting your questions. Remember, if you want access to exclusive videos and have your questions answered, please sign up for Times Radio Frontline membership. And Frontline is also available in your favorite podcast outlet. Just search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you. Goodbye.